Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Baratas Talking to Interesting People. And tonight I am joined by Stephen Palos from CHASA. Due to an error on my side, Aziza isn't joining us this evening. She's actually joining us, I believe, next week, Tuesday. There was a mix-up due to my lack of communication skills, which if you know me and understand how I email and I text, that shouldn't come as a surprise. Mortifying only to me. Stephen, thank you for being here. I'm glad we got you before you head off on your hunting trip. And just as a matter of interest for those who don't know you, quick background bio. Who are you and who are Charza, and where do you guys fit into the picture?
Gideon, thanks for the invitation to be here, first of all. Probably far too long in the coming. I've known you many, many years. I never really got around to being involved in your show, which is a disgrace, and I apologize. Where do I come from in the space of things? Well, I'm a hunter first and foremost, a passionate hunter. I'm not a professional hunter. I'm not an outfitter. I'm not in the business of hunting. I hunt for myself, for my own pleasure. It's something I inherited from my father and many of his friends and my uncles, and I grew up with it. Not so much in rifle and plains game hunting as I currently do. I was raised more from Greek heritage, and my father was quite keen about his wing shooting. So I was raised as a wing shooter and cut my teeth under the discipline of minimalistic shotgun shooting occasionally. But just after matriculating, one of his friends, who was quite a character and a raconteur of note and a hunter, told me that I must stop now with that nonsense scattergun philosophy of my father's and get a little bit more precise and start learning how to shoot real animals. And that was my introduction to my first ever impala hunt back in 1982. And that bug really bit. My recently late uncle and myself experienced that together, and the very next week after coming back from that hunt, we were out buying 308 Sarco rifles, those years from old Roy Swaden and Sons, who were still going. Many of your older viewers might remember Roy Swaden as a prominent gun dealer of the 1970s and 80s. And that got us going into hunting, and it just grew from there. Every job I've had in life, I was working to basically go hunting, except later in life when I started to have kids, and I was working to put some food on the table and then go hunting, and then do some hunting to put food on the table. So it works all ways. So that's me. CHASA, I got into the CHASA family of organizations through my own home association. CHASA is a confederate model. So we are not an association of members, we're an association of associations. 23 different, very different cultured associations around the country. Some majors that you'll know of is the likes of Kaapjag in the Western Cape, State Kaapjagters, the Eastern Cape Game Management Association in the Eastern Cape area, Border Hunting Club, and Amatola Hunters and others down in that region, Free State Hunters, Bosveld Hunters, Vrystaatjag, to name a few, but 23. And amongst that, some niche associations that specialize in let's say, a narrow field. Case in point is the SA Falconry Association, or a CHASA member, for example. But my own home association there is the Big Boar Association of South Africa, and our personal passion is bringing back the era of the old dangerous game calibers and rifles, the double rifles and the big bolt action rifles that are typically used to hunt your pachyderms and bigger animals. And we have shooting disciplines and skills based on reenacting hunting scenarios with such firearms. And our motto is addicted to recoil, and we live that properly. And that got me onto the exco, and finally, as a representative to CHASA, got me exposed to the CHASA family. And later on, I became vice chair and then chairperson of CHASA. And finally, when they were professionalizing the position of CEO, I applied for that and was appointed the CEO of CHASA about 6 years back now, which has now become a full-time function, working for the association full-time. And yeah, it's been a very interesting and very pleasant ride with some very special people, and a lot of learning along the way from some really grand folk from the hunting sphere and shooting sphere, for that matter.
Well, it's definitely, I would wager a guess or hazard a guess that you get to work with some very interesting people from many different walks of life. Shooting the big ball thing does sound incredibly interesting to me. And I would gather you would need a strong shoulder and definite addiction to recoil to really flourish at that. And that kind of kicks me off to our first point, is different calibers, different ammunition. All of these things are directly threatened by these proposed amendments that have now been open for comment for nearly 2 months. That comment period is coming to an end on the 2nd of August. And then the process goes forward from there. I don't think the fight is over, and I don't think anyone thinks the fight is over. But from a hunter's point of view, there are a great many things that could have extremely debilitating effects on hunters, specifically sport shooters as well. There's huge overlap between those two sectors pertaining to the negatives on this. If you wouldn't mind just expanding from your side the concerns pertaining that how they would manifest and why they are negative, or rather why they are undesirable.
Gideon, the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question, first and foremost, is one of the worst things from the act we have at the moment, which didn't exist in our firearm legislation before, to box firearm owners into very specific categories. The ones of self-defense, and then special self-defense needs, and then collectors and hunters and sport shooters, and so on through the professional things. And what that kind of did is it created the notion, I think, in the legislators more than obviously not in our space, but in the legislator space, is that everybody is either this or that or that or that. They don't make space for the person that has a multitude of these things. And this new draft, instead of solving that problem, actually amplifies that problem, in that it limits us down to, I think, a maximum of 6 firearms for all purposes. Now, I can tell you, I'm sitting with 4.22 rifles as a dedicated hunter. And those 4.22 rifles are not used in the hunting field, but they are used in preparation of hunting. And each one of them has a completely different setup for a very specific purpose in preparing for hunting, whether myself or other youngsters. Typically, for example, in one case, I've got a miniaturized .22 so that youngsters can get confident. I've got a .22 that has very much the same size and characteristics as my Mauser open-sighted hunting rifles. I've got another .22 that's scoped and on a single stage trigger that more suits my range of normal hunting rifles, the scope. So I've got a few old collectible Mausers I love to hunt with open sights, and then I've got a few scoped rifles that I hunt with for most of my hunting. But I've got a .22 set up for each of those so that I can practice cheaply and often to be adept at that. And that leaves out, we're not even really getting yet into the more specialist things like a double rifle for a different style of hunting again. So there's just so many different needs that once a person is in fact dedicated in the dictionary sense of the word dedicated, not the legislative sense, to hunting, you need a lot of guns before you really satisfy all the types of hunting and shooting scenarios you can face. And there's no doubt that this law will be a death knell for those of us who take it more seriously than the once in a year occasional hunter does. It will limit us in so many respects. The reloading is, for me, at least 3 of the rifles in my gun safe would be dead in the water because they're obsolete cartridges for which I have to reload. And I'm just one of many, many people like this. I'm not speaking for myself here. I'm speaking for literally hundreds. And when you start having these interests, you find the other people and you realize how many there are. And then, of course, sport shooting, again, which feeds very much into any discipline in shooting, and hunting, of course, is critical that the sport shooting develops the skill. They, again, have very specific needs. Again, in the rifle types and setups, but more importantly, again, in the reloading, you cannot afford to shoot factory ammunition on an ongoing basis as a serious sport shooter. Even if your sport shooting is at a relatively entry level, the sheer volume of shooting done and the cost of those components today is problematic. And then there's, of course, the one other thing which, again, that old mentor I speak to, he said, we're not reloaders, we're hand loaders. And the message in that is you're actually loading for quality. You're not only actually loading to save the money. In many instances, a reload cartridge could end up costing more if you're using premium components that you cannot get in a factory ammunition, especially in the hunting field where you're needing premium bullets for that ethical, proper kill, and particularly when you're shooting tough animals at close quarters and you need bonded core bullets or certain classes of monolithics and that type of thing. You're not going to find this stuff on the shelf. So reloading is absolutely essential. It's essential also from a conservation perspective, because in areas, for example, where the lead can end up being scavenged by vultures and things like that, it's an ethical choice to perhaps choose to use a monolithic copper bullet. Again, there's no variety of that on the shelf as ammunition. You need to load for that. So there's many areas where reloading is absolutely essential to keep the hunting sports and the shooting sports going. It would be a death knell for both of those things if reloading was outlawed. It's a crazy notion. I hope that puts some of perspective. Sorry, a long answer to that question, but yeah.
No, that's a good answer, because it really does illustrate how ill thought through these proposed amendments are, and the extensive amount of negative externalities that they will have should they, and that's a big should, big if they ever become law. The knock-on effect will be far-reaching and bad, because essentially what will happen is you will eviscerate the hunting and sports shooting sectors. You will remove the most dedicated participants from it, those who are really spending the most, and this might sound like an overly capitalist notion, but those who are spending the most amount of money in order to participate. That money that is spent is hugely important for the industry to exist, and you decapitate to a large degree the most important people in those sectors, which in turn they're not directly subsidizing, but their economic activity and their dedicated participation makes it possible for those who cannot quite do it to that level to actually be able to participate and gain some value, much needed value from it, and add value themselves. It's terrible. It's actually the more we think about it, the more conversations I have with people adding, like yourself, adding more depth and more layers to that onion, it becomes very obvious that these amendments are awful, and it again makes it nakedly obvious that no one who's a genuine stakeholder was properly engaged. Now, I do believe CHASA had some. Sorry, Stephen.
Yeah. So there's the rub. No one that was affected were duly engaged properly.
Well, that's the thing, and I do recall that CHASA had some major successes in the past. Being the devil's advocate, I'd have to ask the question. You guys have been a bit quiet lately, but I'm sure you'll tell me why. But what is the CHASA strategy? How do you guys approach it, and what do you think is the path forward from the CHASA perspective in addressing these specific issues?
Yeah. Gideon, I'd like to start out by saying hunters, I think, by nature are genuinely optimistic people. We believe this. We believe in the planet we live in. We believe in conservation. We believe in sustainable use. And we like to believe in the country and the government we have. And the CHASA stance has always been to engage that government positively and proactively. Not to try and shout from the rooftops, not to beat drums. CHASA is turning 40 years old this year. So CHASA didn't come about as a result of the first Firearms Control Act of 2000 or some new knee-jerk reaction. The founding fathers of CHASA saw a need for this 40-something years ago. And all along, in all that time, we've never litigated once against government. We're on the cusp right now, and that's not our style. Because this may be a little bit of a bridge too far for us because of the way we've been treated in the last, I would say, 3 years. We genuinely always put out a friendly hand to all the organs of government we deal with, whether it's the police themselves at the central firearms level or at senior levels where we've had opportunities in the past, or whether it's been to the Secretary of Police, the various ones over the time from The first, when I started working in the space, was at that time Jenny Irish Kuboshiani. And all the way through now, we've tried to engage. Where we are still fairly comfortable that we are received well is in our parliamentary portfolio committee for police. We do believe we get an honest ear there. What we have seen, however, is that up until now, and I think this might be a little bit of a consequence of, let's say, this horrible decade, the so-called lost decade that everyone speaks about, there's no doubt about it, and it's come out clearly in the Zondo Commission, is that part and parcel of the project that was deliberately took away a lot of the teeth from the portfolio committee programs and processes. So they weren't really effective oversight bodies. So we've been well received there, but there's very little they can do for us up until now other than putting in reports and stating the obvious. But I get a sense for things bigger than just firearm ownership and the police portfolio, that part and parcel of let's say, the rejuvenation of our society in our country is going to be stronger oversight roles of the parliamentary portfolio committees. And I'm cautiously optimistic that our relationship there will start to bear fruit then. Because we've been good travelers to that committee. And, you know, it is the people's parliament. So let's go there as the people and state our case fairly honestly and openly. So that's been our policy up until now. Unfortunately, and I do think that it's part of a problem on our side as the collective firearm ownership organizations, just after the Firearm Summit of 2015, there was a change of guard at the Secretary's office to one Reniva Fourie. And for whatever reason, the momentum we had with Jenny Irish Kuboshiani towards inputs into legislation died a death. And we didn't really pick it up in the time of Reniva Fourie, none of us. And in actual fact, it came as a bit of a surprise to me when I did a bit of research once to find that there was a new person in that role in the form of the current incumbent, which is Alvin Repair. And I did get a toe in the door, and we had a meeting there, if I remember correctly, a first meeting with him around about 2017-ish. And we were in his office for about half an hour, and we were well received, politely received, but I got a sense that they were working on the stuff without us. Thereafter to keep it going, and it was quite a fight, and I got toe back in the door for all firearm stakeholders again to a meeting that we held in March of 2019 with him. From that was supposed to flow a process, because there was a lot of us in that meeting, and all the stakeholders that are prominent were present. And in the end, we had to draft or recreate the minutes because they had lost a laptop, etc., etc. Time passed, and we were meant to enter into a proper stakeholder engagement. But he just didn't do it. He just never, ever really seized the hand we offered. And then suddenly this draft popped out of the woodwork. Clearly, they've been working about us without us. And that's the problem. And this is technical stuff that they can never do without the firearm owners in the room. Even if they were pro-firearm, which they aren't, they'd have messed it up. Having an anti-firearm bias and then excluding us altogether, they've properly messed it up. It might play into our hands because they've messed it up to such a degree that it is a complete hash. It just cannot work.
And they ignored their own research that they paid for want of a better expression, our money.
They refer to it and do exactly the opposite in the actual draft. It's wonderful. If they don't open the door to us, well, then the writing's clear that it's going to be a constitutional court thing. It's going to land up being a fight. The president himself suggested that would be where it might finish up when he was quizzed in a recent news broadcast. I saw there was somewhere where he said this might land up being sorted out by the courts. But why does it always have to be the courts? Why can we not be honest and open with our government and get the same courtesy in return? We sit ready, and I'm happy to sit at a table with the anti-firearm people present in the room to thrash this stuff out. I don't mind if the gun-free South Africa people are at the table, because you need the devil's advocate. But for goodness sakes, let our government be an honest broker and sit there and hear all sides of the stuff. If they're not prepared to do that, well, we're preparing for a fight. And as I say, we've been in existence for 40 years. And if this is what we've existed to do, and this is the moment, we are here. As they say, cometh the moment, cometh the man. And we will be there, and we'll step up. We'll step up to the plate, hopefully as good citizens, but we'll also step up to the plate as good fighters if need be, with good argument,
that's
solid argument.
Excellent. That's excellent, Stephen. And I think that's, hopefully some sort of sense prevails, and this entire business is discarded, and we can get a genuine forum where real solutions are actually presented by the people in the know. My own personal experience as a former employee of the state, how they at least used to treat their own employees at one stage, was very similar to your experience with the civilian secretariat. Is there were lots of meetings, there were lots of polite discussions, seemingly in good faith, lots of promises, and then a sudden dearth of communication, and then massive and far-reaching unilateral decisions without any stakeholder engagement that had disastrous effects on everyone except the people making them, which seems to be a bit of a theme pertaining government departments and the people running them. And in many cases, one is forced into that confrontation. There are people who are still sitting at the moment refusing to go into the confrontation in certain places, and they're struggling to pay their bills as a direct result thereof. So I suppose there is a lesson in that. But the arguments you've laid on the table tonight alone indicates that CHASA has been studying this thing. You as individuals and as an organization have appraised the effects of this. Now, hunting is not just is not remotely a mere leisure activity. It is important for agriculture, for conservation. It has a huge economic role that it plays. It supports the livelihoods of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people directly, let alone the indirect livelihoods it supports. How massive is hunting in South Africa, roughly? You don't have to give me detailed figures. I mean, that would be a bit of an ask.
Look, we've had a decade of fantastic work with the Department of Environmental Affairs, with some hiccups along the way and some current ones that we're dealing with. But be that as it may, we've spent this time, specifically under the ministership of the late Edna Molewa, developing what was finally announced by the president in Thohoyandou back in 2018, August, I think it was, as part of Operation Phakisa, which is a strategy of the National Development Plan, a thing called the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy. And hunting is the fundamental underscoring element that makes that viable. You remove the hunting, and that whole scheme is dead in the water. With the land, with the transformation, with the conservation, that whole thing is not there without the hunting. So we have protected areas in South Africa of approximately 6% of our national estate. The Millennium Goals and in terms of our obligations in the biodiversity obligations in our international obligations, is to try to get to 20 to 25% of protected areas. We're never going to get there at state expense in your classic protected areas, such as your Kruger parks, and your national parks and provincial parks, etc. Private estate in South Africa under wildlife is 3 times bigger. And the vast, vast majority of that is absolutely underpinned by hunting economy. You remove the hunting economy and that is dead. It's actually an interesting an irony, and it is a bigotry, that even a property that belongs to a rabid anti-hunting animal rights organization sell their oversupply livestock, their game, their wildlife, into hunting operations. Because game, like livestock, increases and increases and increases. So what do you do with it? You can't let it die of starvation when there's an overpopulation. It's production. It's production of marginal land. 20 million hectares, roughly speaking, of private-owned wildlife estate in the country that wasn't there when I was growing up as a youngster. That's been a 4 decades in the making conservation revolution of note globally. Wildlife numbers in South Africa, because of our private wildlife vibrancy, has increased from something like 500,000 head of game in the 1960s to somewhere in the region of 18 to 20 million head of game today. But almost all of that increase has occurred on private land. And without the hunting element, cannot happen. Simply cannot happen. Even if a viewer watching this who is not a hunter, but likes to go into a wildlife area that appears to be non-hunting, you can be damn sure that there's a hunting element either on that property, or the oversupply goes to a hunting element. Otherwise, their viability is gone. Numbers, at least 10 billion rand of economic activity per annum from the local hunters. I think it's another 1.5 to 3 billion, I can't quite remember, from foreign hunting clients, but at a high margin. So it's critically important, the foreign clients. They bring us variety of wildlife on the land. If the local ranchers were only catering to local hunters that hunt for the meat, your variety, species of game on the land would be probably a third of what they currently are. The fact that foreigners come into the country to hunt trophy animals, and you can see everyone's trying to knock trophy hunting at the moment like it's some evil, but that element brings the viability to the landowner because of the extra margins in that. And it also brings an incentive to keep animal species that they wouldn't normally do for the meat hunter. So your variety and your mix and your viability all flows from this wonderful combination of a massive local hunters primarily looking for the meat, but will hunt trophies as well. And then the small percentage of foreign clients that come in that are more or less trophy focused. And it works. It's I think direct employment on game ranches at last count, when we did the workshop towards this CHASA project, was about 160,000 direct employed on game farms. But you haven't counted your knock-ons in the taxidermy, the dipping and shipping, the firearms industry, the training industry, the other tourism that occurs as a result of it, shuttle services. There's a ton of services around hunting. The typical foreign trophy tourist spends tenfold what a normal tourist spends. It's just phenomenal numbers.
And all of it happens. Backward linkages are massive. That much I've seen.
In rural areas where the needs are greatest. So it's wonderful.
That's illustrative of it, of the fact that it is. And I mean, when you talk ecotourism, which was an extremely prolific buzzword not all that long ago, you cannot have ecotourism without a hunting economy attached to it. Well, you're not going to have much of a one, as well as the preservation of genetic diversity amongst game, which is incredibly important for its own reasons. That said, so we've touched on the effects these amendments are going to potentially, not are going to have. I'm speaking as if it's a set thing, which it most certainly isn't. I think the explosion of public opposition to it has been impossible to ignore. We've had media outlets that are traditionally not friendly towards our point of view run incredibly good stories. And then rather bizarrely, and I had this discussion with a friend of mine, Russell Lamberti, the economist, and he said, events always trump debates. You could have a debate for 25 years, be right about everything, no one wants to listen to you, and then something suddenly happens and everyone is on your side of the fence. And I think what happened in Gauteng and Durban, specifically with the level of discipline people conducted themselves while securing their communities, there were a fair amount of hunting rifles among guys protecting their communities, which again indicates that this entire debate isn't one of hunters versus the interests of sport shooters versus the interests of self-defense. handgun carriers, it's all or nothing. Everyone either fights together or they perish together. Have you experienced something similar from the CHASA side? Because many hunters carry guns for self-defense. Many farmers upon which land hunters hunt also equally are interested in that. And then there's the sport shooting element, which is prolific amongst both types.
Yeah, look, first of all, from carrying as a self-defense scenario, the obvious thing is hunting is, generally speaking, a middle class to upper middle class activity, which means you're also the kind of person who's economically active. You may be running a business, or you may be in a job that makes you travel or whatever. So let's face it, the needs of self-defense in our country are general. Pretty much everybody has the need, and some have the ability to take the firearm route as the correct and appropriate means of self-defense. And certainly amongst hunters, it would be an obvious thing because, first of all, they're gun familiar to start with. So the firearm ownership thing is not intimidating. It's quite sad that many people who don't have a hunting background seem to see an impossible barrier to overcome in the firearm ownership aspect. Whereas in actual fact, it's not such a big barrier. And I would encourage anybody that has no firearm background to do not think that you have to be that. There are so many good training providers out there. There's so many good initiatives. To mention one, for argument's sake, if you happen to be a lady, touch base with that wonderful idea of the Girls on Fire movement that was started by Lynette Oxley and a few other great girls that are doing that. So firearm ownership should not be intimidating. I understand totally, however, that our history makes it intimidating. There's a big chunk of our citizenry out there that can only have ever had negative impressions when it comes to firearms. It's incumbent on us to change that perception if we're given the chance. It would be a hell of a lot easier to do that if we were rightfully getting on with our police at the high level, because we should be fellow travelers with them. We should not be locking horns with our police. We are, in actual fact, two sides of the same coin. I don't want to expand too much on what happened in KZN and Gauteng, because I think time will tell how that's dealt with politically, and the devil's in the detail that will also still come out in that regard. But the fact of the matter is that certainly we were seen to be two sides of the same coin, between the private citizen that is legally armed and responsible and those security forces that were employed and engaged, as well as the private security industry. We were all more or less on the same path for the same purpose through those events. That's actually how it should be under normal circumstances. The problem is, the moment that's over, we're back to now fighting again with our police at the high level. We don't really fight with our police at the local level, funny enough. Here and there are incidents, but generally speaking, the beat policeman understands us and we understand him. We find the problem comes where the hierarchy is at the point where they think they're policymakers. Case in point, again, those that would be sitting at the top of a division such as the Central Firearms, they actually believe they're policymakers, whereas actually they're supposed to be policy implementers. And then we hit loggerheads with them. And that's how is the relationship. And it's sad. We should not be at each other's. We actually should be on the same side. Whether you're a hunter, or whether you're a sport shooter, whether you're just a self-defense firearm owner and have no other interest in firearms whatsoever, our police should be our best allies and should not see us as a threat. That's reality. Where we got to and how we got to, I think there's an agent provocateur or two involved in this. I've often noticed that the staff of Gun Free South Africa seem to be very familiar around the corridors of the Secretariat of Police. Too familiar. They know just where to go make their own cup of tea there. We don't seem to have the same comfort in that zone. But we've got to fix that. We've got to get in that space, and we've got to make sure people realize we are not the threat. We are actually the solution.
And that's the thing. There does seem to be an element, certainly, of regulatory capture, but unlike the traditional direction where the regulator is captured by those who it should be regulating, it's captured by external parties with vested interest in seeing the regulated parties done as much harm as possible to the point of eliminating them entirely, which is a massive problem. And the fact that it hasn't been publicly called out for what it is up until now is rather sad indictment of the state of general investigative journalism. But hopefully that is something one can now work on, seeing as that we have this momentum behind us and huge amounts of cooperation between various bodies that up until this amendment was published, or these amendments were published, it did exist, but not to this level. There were no formal relationships, which is now a thing that is happening, and that's heartening to see. But I see we are getting some questions, some hunting-related questions, and I would, since you are the man of the moment, Stephen, I'm going to give them to you. But one is pertaining to the popular calibers of hunting game in South Africa. And this would, I presume, depend very much upon the specific biome that you are hunting in, as well as the game itself. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a big picture crash course quickly of how the stuff actually works for those who are uninitiated and might actually want to start hunting for the first time in their lives.
Generally, and I get this, I happen to have a small shooting range on my small holding where I live. And a lot of guys use it to get their rifle set and whatnot for hunting. And often they're bringing newcomers along who are going with on their first trip but now contemplating a rifle. So I get this question a bit. And what I always do is I start out by saying, all right, who are you likely to be hunting with, and in what biome and what terrain? And what sort of budget animal-wise? Are you going to be hunting a few impalas or springbuck? Are you looking to quickly get into shooting things like blue wildebeests, eland, or even bigger? And that then would determine quite quickly the first rifle you buy. Are you likely to be a one firearm hunter? And there's many of them that are very successful, and you can kind of make it work with, obviously, with restrictions on the extremes. Or are you the sort of person that you've seen it enough now that you know that your first gun is not going to be your only gun? And once you get that picture behind you, you start to answer well. And my typical answer would be in two classes. The first class would be somewhere around the 308 Winchester, 3006, maybe a 7x57 if you have a firearm interest and you like a bit of history, that type of thing. Because that's another question to ask. Are you a firearm person, or are you just interested in the technical side of hunting? The other side then is if you are a bit of an aspirant hunter that wants to try a few things differently, it might make more sense to start with something like a 375, which actually sounds a bit bizarre, but it's probably the rifle. If ever you have these theoretical around the campfire arguments about if you only could have one firearm, what should it be? Heaven forbid. Generally speaking, the one that wins out amongst hunters who hunt a bit is the 375. So that's how I temper my answer to the individual. And then I, of course, ask, are you likely to have a firearm interest to the point that you might want to follow the European calibers, the British calibers, the American calibers, because all of these things add value to the whole experience. If you're not just a hunter but a gun person as well, and I think you are, so you'll understand what I'm talking about. You have to have more. Hunting is the peculiar thing. I believe it's the oldest heritage activity we do as a species ever. So all of these other things, the firearm interest and all that, actually flows from something that's so deep within us. I honestly believe that mankind invented music and dance because of successful hunts, way back in our pedigree somewhere. We know the oldest art is around 86,000 years old and depicts hunting type scenes, or at least it depicts the prey, which one must assume they're painting the prey either because they've been eaten by it or because they're trying to eat it. Otherwise, why paint it? So we're talking about something that's so deep in our psyche, the activity of hunting, and add the value of that with the tools, because a good artist or craftsman is always passionate about the tools as well. So, but yeah, definitely around the 308 to 3006 can't be faulted for normal plains game up to blue wildebeest, but preferably in the Impala Kudu range. If you're going to be hunting springbuck, you might want something a little bit further reaching and milder, like a 6.5 by 55, and a few of the other more modernistic ones I'd rather not mention around that. And so on. So I do believe that each person needs to think about it
I was
a little
about
bit.
to say that that's very much almost an hour-long discussion at the very least, or a webinar level discussion by itself. So I hope that gave you a bit of a insight, ladies and gentlemen, as to how individual orientated that is. Then some of the other questions that popped up is there's quite a few people that make mention of the backlogs and issues at the Central Firearms Registry. And are there any plans presently, or how shall we say, intents of attempting to address it? And what can one do? What are the options specifically at addressing these difficulties?
Yeah, well, for our own member base, we do within our associations try and assist them, and obviously we kind of locked into the same contact particulars that the public have. But sometimes when it comes on an organizational letterhead as an inquiry, it tends to get answered a little bit. I've had some peculiar scenarios in my own life. There's been a spate over the last 2 years of some applications I've had to do in my young son simultaneously. And there's been issues, for example, where I've put in an application. He's put an application in 3 months later. He's got his firearm license in his hand, and I'm waiting another 3 to 6 months after that for my one that preceded his. The nature of the beast, I think many of you would have seen those photographs that did the rounds after the portfolio committee visited the CFR recently. And you saw those massive piles of files waiting apparently in the corridors for processing. And well, I put a little meme up pointing an arrow to one right at the bottom, and I said, "Yes, mine." I think that's the nature of the beast. If you've got to the bottom of one of those piles and they're working down that pile every day, and then the delivery arrives and new ones get put on top, that one at the bottom isn't going to be dealt with. And how to get it out of there? In one instance, I managed to get hold of a colonel on a rifle. It was approaching a year, and he said to me, "Look, just send me the whole application again because I've lost it." Well, I think he hasn't lost it. He just knows that there's no way in that office that he'll find it. So he did receive my whole application again, and within about 2 months of that, I had my license in my hand. But perseverance, politeness, and if you're a member of an association, whichever it might be, if they could approach on a letterhead in cases where it's running long, I think it could help. And luck, sadly, that's the only other. I must say the percentage of complaints from our members is not that high on new ordinary applications. Not so great on the second round of amnesty applications. Don't seem to be moving. The first round of applications of amnesty, the first batch of that first amnesty appeared to be coming through in dribs and drabs from what I hear. General applications are happening, not within the 90 working days, but let's say within 130, 140 days, we seem to see the trend is happening. But it takes a lot of patience.
And unfortunately, the people who you are dealing with via telephones or face-to-face are seldom the ones that are responsible for this mess. I mean, if just to look at those photographs alone, when this Protection of Personal Information Act came into force earlier this month, I think it was the 1st of July, I wondered a little bit whether or not the CFR itself actually complies with that law, because if you have just piles and piles and piles of information containing very sensitive information regarding the amount of guns an individual owns, what their address is, and all the other information that they volunteer in order to motivate need for the next one. It's a bit alarming to think, okay, we have this system, we have this law that in fact protects that information, but it's impossible for the police themselves to apparently comply with it. And how on earth that building isn't condemned? Because I would harbor some doubts about the structural integrity of the floors with that amount of, I mean, if that is the picture on every single floor, how much paper must be lying in that building? Must weigh tons upon metric tons.
Mm. Well, I think my first comment on that would be not to suggest to them that they might be out of line with the Popular Act, because they'll try and fix that, and they'll fix that at the expense of delivery. So let's
that was
that
was exactly my thought, as well, as I think that, my God, it could only make things worse. It definitely won't improve it.
In terms of their working circumstances, I mean, obviously it's a problem, but it starts actually with their working systems. Clearly, nobody's become a flow manager there and assisted them to have a system that follows some logic, just basic logic. Now, I'm a bit blessed. I live in an area with a particularly friendly, not just user-friendly, but positive approach DFO. And that gives me and all of the people that live in our area here such an edge, because the experience starts out positively. But you can see they've got a system in their office. You know your stuff is not getting stuck at your DFO. So they are seeing where they're getting frustrated, where they can't help the client in turn, because they're seeing the pockets of problems along the way. So it must be a bit demoralizing for those that are trying to do a good job when the system doesn't work for them either. And I think that's just one thing that all the public must always bear in mind. In fact, with all civil servants, is always bear in mind that it might not be the person you're dealing with that is the cause of the problem. You might be as much a victim of the circumstances you are. I had to renew my driver's license last week, and I had to travel to a town an hour away. And that was my exact experience after 2 days of having to go back after them not being online and all the rest of it. The person that eventually helped me was working through his lunch hour to try and help. So it wasn't his fault. He was doing the best he could. And that's the nature of the civil service at the moment, I suppose. Is a lot of people trying, poor leadership, poor resources, and all the rest of it.
And just terrible management of those resources by the people higher up responsible for it. I'm also can only speak well of my DFO. I had 2 applications I handed in at the end of March. They got to the CFR, so they got from Strand to Provincial to the CFR by the 15th of April. So that wasn't bad going. That was just over 2 weeks. And they've been sitting at the registry untouched since then. So there very much is, as you say, like there is a massive problem in how these systems are managed upstream, very much so. Yeah. It's also the question as to why we're still sitting in the 21st century where I can order a pizza on my telephone and live track it via GPS where it is. We are still sitting with destroying whole parts of the Amazon rainforest worth of paper that we are duplicating and duplicating information on in ink. That obviously isn't a process that lends itself to efficiency. I mean, obviously the various foreign bodies have come with solutions as to how this process can be streamlined, how it can be digitized. Any inputs on that from your side?
A radical one, which I suggested some years ago to the previous chair of the portfolio committee, and he actually quite liked it, funny enough. Move the administration side to Home Affairs. Let police just have the roles that are essential to them. They're the post box, they're the inspectorate, they're the obviously the enforcing agent where there's compliance issues. And I likened it at the time as our liquor laws, for example, sit under the exact same sub-department in SAPS that firearms do, the flash unit. But liquor licenses are handled by the Department of Trade and Industry at a provincial level, the various sub-departments. The SAPs have a very fundamental role on inspection and reporting, etc. But their role is not to administer it. Because frankly, SAPs are not good administrators generally. Nobody becomes a policeman in order to become a paper pusher, generally speaking. No passionate policeman does. So you even have a scenario where any administrative function that they do, merely going into actually to report something, is tedious because it's not their first skill when they start writing out those long dockets. I mean, they should have staff that are specially trained and in actual fact not police people, but more clerical people that do docket writing on their behalf, and actually should be trained more under the Department of Justice than police, and they become more efficient. So I would love to see a scenario where somehow or other SAPs handle a few things, but something like Home Affairs finally, maybe on smart ID cards, administers the actual licenses themselves. The decision making, SAPs should have a say in it, but the final decision, it would be interesting to see where that should lie. Maybe back in the old days when magistrates used to issue these things could be a solution for that, to have the final say on approved or not approved. But really, they could make it a lot simpler, even if they want.
Well, that's exactly it. And the necessity for approved and not approved, or rather the criteria for that, you can essentially boil down to a checklist which leads you to a yes/no decision based on the boxes. And that definitely can be devolved to a provincial level, or even better, to a sort of regional level by whatever degree one wishes to do it. Ultimately, your DFO will know you best. And if your DFO's decision is occasionally moderated by some internal affairs third party to make sure that there's no sort of silver crossing palms or things like that for undesirable individuals to fraudulently or illegally obtain licenses, then you've got a working system, as long as everyone understands that all systems are imperfect, and that's something that we unfortunately have to live with. There's huge scope for improvement. In fact, this entire system can be made to work. As horrible as it is for me as an anarchist to say it, the system can work, and it can actually work very well. And in fact, it can work to the extent that the preamble of the Act as it's written is satisfied. But moving away from that, Stephen, back to, since we're running, well, we're nearly out of time. How can people? How would you encourage people to become part of CHASA? What sort of activities can they look at doing with you, or the other associations? Any general sort of advice or tips for people just starting out who are interested?
CHASA itself, as I said, there's 23 affiliated associations. So the easiest place to find those is on a drop down on our links part of our website. The website is simply www.chaza.co.za, and you'll find links, and then of that there's affiliated associations with a drop down, and that will open the names of the 23 associations around the country. And we've got pretty much the whole country covered. We've got quite a few Gauteng associations, and pretty much around the rest of the country as well. Once you've found the organization in your area, or if it's a national organization with an interest that you're following up on that one, approach them and go through whatever the discussions are. They're all very friendly, they're all well staffed, and they will help you on your way. That's as far as joining CHASA is concerned. Any problems with that, contact the CHASA office directly. That's also on our website, the contact particulars. We've got an office down in Uitenhage, which is managed by a wonderful lady there named Desiree, and she will assist. And my contact particulars and the Exco's contact particulars are also on the website. So not difficult to find us if you just Google CHASA. What do you want to do starting out? First of all, we've also got a very active sport shooting element to us. It's a lot of it is hunting themed, but we do have a handgun discipline as well based on the NRA action shooting model. That's quite well subscribed, and we do have a shotgun discipline as well, and it's quite exciting. And we have what we call a ranking site, where the competition is kind of like a postal shoot that everybody shoots at your various associations all year long, and your scores get fed into that, and you can see how you're doing. So from hunting simulated things like our what we call our Flakterskiet discipline, then we've got a gong shoot scenario, we've got the shotgun discipline, we've got the handgun discipline. You can find any and every level of .22 disciplines at standard and open classes across all the various demographics of age and gender, etc. You can come and shoot. Getting into hunting, again, mentorship. If you come from a no hunting background whatsoever, mentorship is the way to go. Find hunters in your area, contact your association, your CHASA association in the area through that same source, get hold of them, and you'll find the people are very accommodating. The moment they know that you are new to something and you want help, there's nobody would ever not embrace a question of that sort within our family. And you will definitely find in that variety that we have, our diversity, you'll find a place for you and your interests within CHASA. We make it very people friendly and user friendly. It's not a big deal. Very easy to get involved. You've just got to reach out to touch base, send a message, and we'll certainly be happy. And we've got a Facebook page as well, by the way, so you can look for us on Facebook as well. But I prefer emails for contact or a phone call.
That's fantastic. I think that's exactly a great starting point for people, because that's always intimidating for a newbie. Even if you've owned firearms for a long time, if you have absolutely no idea about hunting and hunting associations, it can be an intimidating new world to dip your toes into. But I think, as you could probably attest to the growth of the activity, lots of people dip their toes and then they find themselves swimming before they wipe the sleep out their eyes. So
that's for sure.
And having dealt with CHASA affiliated associations in the past, I've always dealt with friendly individuals and welcoming and willing to share information and similar. So whatever you guys are doing, please keep it up. Thank you. That's good work. And just one last thing from the audience. We've got literally a couple of minutes. If you've got any other last minute questions for Stephen. Sorry, Stephen, you go.
Questions for me?
Yeah, I thought I interrupted you for a sec. Okay. Because otherwise I'll have to think of one. There we go. This is from Garage Metal Shop. He's actually from the US. And he says, thank you for a very enlightened conversation. We'd love to have you back on if you are keen to maybe take the discussion, past gun politics, picks a bit deeper into hunting itself, and not just the usual controversies attached to it that I suppose you comment on a daily basis, but also the more technical questions that people who are lay people and don't understand it would like to ask.
Well, what we could maybe do there, Gideon, is one of the things that we've been driving for some years and we've now got right is a coalition of like-minded associations, which we've called the Sustainable Use Coalition of Southern Africa, where CHASA has joined hands with the Professional Hunters FASA, with NatShoot, who many of you will be very familiar with SA Wing Shooters, with the Taxidermy Association, the Falconry Association, the Wildlife Ranching Association, the True Green Alliance of old Ron Thompson that many old hunters would know well, and others. And what we're doing is we are driving a sustainable use advocacy and lobbying agenda through the SUCO SA. And it might be a good idea to tell your viewers a little bit about that and maybe invite one or two of the other core members of SUCO to join in that discussion. Maybe a representative from the Professional Hunters and a representative from the Wildlife Ranchers, myself, and even one or two. I don't know what your limit is in a logical size discussion, but we could do something like that, and I think it could be quite interesting. I think the members would find that an interesting window to look into.
I think that's a fantastic idea, and that would definitely be something I'm hugely open to. I think it would be a very fun discussion, and I think everyone will pull in. And we finally got a question. Last one, Philippe van Velbergen from the UK. Thank you for always tuning in, sir. I really appreciate seeing you here. Stephen, are dedicated hunters renewals handled at province? I presume that's provincial level.
Dedicated hunter. The application for a firearm for a dedicated, all renewals of firearms with SAPs, your license renewals, whether you're a dedicated hunter, occasional hunter, the self-defense firearms collectors are generally handled at the provincial level. All renewals. If you're talking about renewing your actual dedicated status with your association, that doesn't get renewed, it gets maintained by virtue of your activity reports. So our role in that as an accredited association is to just ensure the ongoing activities as prescribed, which are fairly doable for anybody that generally hunts a couple of times a year or sport shoots a couple of times a year. It's not onerous. And if you aren't shooting or sport shooting or hunting for this particular year, give a reasonable reason back to your association, and that will also serve to maintain your status with the accredited association. So firearm renewals at province, all firearm renewals, dedicated status maintenance is through your accredited association you're a member of.
Fantastic. I think that answers the question thoroughly. And thank you, Stephen, for joining us this evening. Thank you for sharing the insight, the knowledge. Enjoy the hunting trip later this week.
We'll do. It's a small one with maybe one impala on the menu.
It's getting out there in the bush doing something you love, and I'm sure that's also something that exactly. Okay, last question, because it's a really good one. Is there a youth outreach or new hunter training program?
Absolutely. Actually, we've got junior training in our associations. Interestingly, although we have a junior training manual, we find that most of the CHASA youth elect to straight away do the senior training in any case, even when they're 12, 13, 14 years old, because they're quite able to. But absolutely, junior training is very much involved in an aspect of all of our associations. So training is there. And we've also now started a youth committee within the CHASA board structure it's in the national definition of youth, which is hunters up to 35 years old. So instead of us old guys trying to drive the policies and to drive the activities and the way forward, we are drawing younger members of our associations into the actual structures of CHASA. And their first, some of you may have picked up that we had a National Hunting Day for the first time this year, which we shared with all. It was co-branded by NatShoot, helped us a lot to get it out. It wasn't just a CHASA initiative. FASA, WRSA, everybody helped us get the National Hunting Day going, and we hope to make that an annual event on the first Saturday of May every year. But that was absolutely the brainchild of our youth element. They conceived it, they branded it, they drove the marketing of it, and it was very successful. And we're hoping next year it's going to really, really hit hard. Absolutely. Youth is the way to, and we have a very active hunter and his mentor photo competition every year. The photo is merely there to prove that you've mentored a newbie into hunting. And the newbie doesn't have to be a youngster or a child. Any person hunting his first animal that has been mentored into hunting. We've got quite a generous prize every year, which can be entered through the CHASA affiliation for that, so that we encourage people to bring new hunters into the game. We want people to take up the world's oldest heritage activity.
Fantastic. I think that answers the question thoroughly. And if you've got more questions, maybe not get a hold of Stephen directly, but you probably can. But get a hold of CHASA. They are an organization geared towards steering people in the right direction, getting them involved with the correct associations for their geographic area, all this sort of stuff. It's a very well-oiled machine that has been around for 4 decades, as I have learned this evening. So make use of that facility and sign up to it. And I'm sure Stephen would be most happy to help, or his associates would be most happy to help. And on that note, we've got to get going. But thank you so much for joining us, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Tomorrow night, I'm back at 8 p.m. with retired General Leonard Max talking about gang violence, entirely different discussion to the one we've had tonight. So tune in for that one after dinner. For now, thank you. Stay safe, stay warm, and see you soon.